Thanks. I hope you guys all enjoyed the tutorial today. I really liked some of the talks, even though it wasn't even full attention, they completely hit home. Actually, thank you for making the decision sticking around, because that's what this talk is about. This photograph you've been looking at, which is my title slide, it's a photograph of 3 reed warbler eggs, which is a bird, and 1 cuckoo egg. And I find it intensely beautiful, but it's also not back to my past, because back in 1998, I was studying biology at the University of Essen, it's my hometown in Germany. And I realized I wasn't really into it anymore, because as much as I love biology, I like playing games more. And I realized that what I was doing at night, which was to make Doom and Quake levels and hanging out on IRC, talking to other people doing the same stuff, I realized I could actually do that for a living, and I could become a professional game developer. Now, at this point, I was already an accomplished level designer in that I'd been making quite a few Doom levels, which, got pretty good attention, were included in some best-of lists, and I contributed to what we called megawatts, which were these high-profile community map chests that we would give out, and they were complete 32-level replacement. And then I started making Quake levels as soon as it was released, because just like everybody else, I was looking forward to Quake, and I wanted to be ready, which became my crowning amateur achievement, I guess. It was called Beyond Belief. It was a 9-level single-player replacement for Quake. And it got a lot of attention. It was featured on Blues News, which was my crowning achievement back then. It got like 10,000 downloads in the first week, which was awesome back then. And through that, I got my first job offer in the gaming industry at Ritual Entertainment, because some of the people I knew from IRC championed my work there. So pretty much exactly 16 years to the day, in March 1998, at age 22, I found myself at the airport with a single suitcase, making the decision to leave friends, family, and country behind, because I was moving to Texas, Dallas, Texas. So since then, I've worked as a level designer on quite a few games, and the last game I actually created levels for was in an official level design position, was Dead Space 2. But I changed gears a little bit afterwards. I was the lead designer on Star Wars 1313, which unfortunately got canned right after last GDC because Disney doesn't like making stuff. And now, it's all good, right? I'm actually the design director on an unannounced, I can't really talk about it, by a assuredly awesome project at 2K Games. And initially this was kind of bothering me a little bit, because I was hitting this roadblock about what to talk about at this GDC, because I haven't shipped anything for 3.5 years and I didn't know exactly what I could talk about. But I realized that there's actually some overlap between the last game I worked on, which was Dead Space 2, and what I'm doing right now, what I have been doing on the last couple of jobs, which is being in some sort of design leadership position. Because in those positions, I have to be able to explain what I like about games, right? As a design director, I'd better be able to formalize some preferences about games into some sort of rules, because I want to be able to put that out there, discuss it with the design department, and so we can create some sort of shared design sensibility for the entire project. And I realized that the closest I've ever actually come to doing this, at least publicly, was in 2012, right here at Level Design in a Day, because I did this talk called Player Stories and Designer Stories, which was framed around Dead Space 2. So in this talk, as a super quick recap, I explained my preference for the player story, because in my mind, that's the biggest way in which we use the medium specificity of games. And I proposed that strong player stories are found in games which are rich in agency. So I talked about agency, right? I explained how games actually afford agency in multiple areas: systemic, spatial, scheduling agency, and then went into exactly how systemic agency is the only one that's actually fundamental to games. The other two are optional, but we need to have good systemic agency to create really good gameplay, for good gameplay experience. So saying that this kind of game is still a great game, right? Even if it doesn't allow the player to choose multiple paths through the level or to customize the character, this can still be a great game. Now, all of this was just in service of refuting one specific map that you see on the internet a lot, which is this one. Because you often see this described, or to describe how modern first-person or third-person games are crap, right? Oh my God, everything was better back then, and look at Doom, back then you could explore, and now you can't do it. And I was just pointing out that this is actually incredibly misleading, because a game like Dead Space 2, which might be on the right there, can be just as fun and afford just as much agency as Doom on the left there. You just wouldn't be able to tell it from the map. And that's because the map doesn't actually express everything that's going on in the systemic agency. So that then manifested itself in this little comparison chart in the end. And we're saying, you know what, both Doom and Dead Space actually afford the same amount of systemic agency. They're quite similar in the complexity of the low-level gameplay interactions that they create, so they're both as much fun. And then I said that this map needs to die because, linear levels can still create a sense of really strong personal player stories. So that was in 2012, bringing me back to today. And a problem I have. I like this talk I did in 2012. I think it was actually really good. It just hasn't helped me at all at my job. It hasn't helped me at expressing a design opinion. And that's because the talk, as I found out, wasn't really actionable. Because I didn't explain how systemic agency is actually created. So I can't use it as a reference to talk to other people about it, right? And I was pretty much saying in 2012 that the core gameplay of Doom and Dead Space 2, which are both combat, share some major commonalities because they both afford lots of systemic agency. It's just then, oops, if you ask me to elaborate, I couldn't actually tell you how. Now I actually know why this happened. For one, it's because agency, the actual topic of that talk, is a result. It's a player-facing definition of something. It's a player-facing definition of players feeling empowered. So any analysis of this is bound to not be useful to designers because we're describing something that's important to players. But there's a bigger reason here, and those were 3 unspoken assumptions that I realized I made that I shouldn't have made. Now, in my mind, it was always crystal clear that the way we create agency is, well, it's going to be a result of meaningful choice. So I didn't even go into this. I didn't elaborate at all. I just assumed that, well, if I tell you that you can take multiple approaches to a combat space, like I did using BioShock as an example, everybody would automatically know how and why those approaches are meaningful or differentiated and how it's meaningful in the first place. Now, the second assumption was that in my mind, meaningful choice had been really clearly defined through rules of play, actually, so I didn't actually explain that concept because I figured it was a shared understanding. Well, I can do this now, actually, real quick, and then the talk is over. Rules of play's definition of meaningful choice is that meaningful choice has to be discernible and integrated. In other words, any choice that we present to the player in the game needs to be obvious to the player, both in the setup but also in the outcome that we get of it, and it needs to feed back into the game and advance this simulation in some shape or form, right? And I really like this definition. I've been using the definition in my own little design razor. Like if you work with me, I usually analyze and design good gameplay by just asking what is the skill check or the meaningful choice. The idea being that if we can really dig into that, at the end we'll kind of know if we have something that might be fun in the end. And okay, great. The big problem is assumption number 3. I was actually making an assumption that this was a definition which was widely disseminated and agreed upon. And that's just simply not true. As I've been looking through all of these game design, psychology, biology books, and so on, the word meaningful is all over the place, and it's always used to describe slightly different things without ever really defining it. I mean, I didn't even bother to put examples up here because there were too many. Just believe me, I didn't know exactly what meaningful was supposed to mean. And I think that's a real problem because now if we want to talk about meaningful choice, we don't have a shared understanding as to why decisions matter and what meaningful choice actually is and when meaningful choice is and isn't. Same goes actually for this famous quote. I mean, it's clever, but it's not actionable either, right? Because interesting and meaningful are pretty much the same thing. So how are you going to act on that? So we don't really know what's interesting or meaningful. And when we don't know if a decision is meaningful or interesting and when not, we're going to have a whole bunch of design meetings where we go, let's do that because that's totally interesting to the player. And that's not really a good design practice to design anything around and spend I don't know how many $1 million on. So that's what this talk is about today. I want to talk about meaningful choice in game and level design, and instead of making assumptions this time, I'm going to start from scratch. So in this talk, I want to fully understand when and why choice matters to us. I want to understand why we play games as a result of that. And then I want to, this time, actually explain what systemic agency is. Because once I know how a systemic agency is actually created, and hopefully you guys know as well what I'm thinking about this, I can then go back and I can qualify why I believe that both Doom and Dead Space are really made from the same cloth after like all these years apart. And then finally, the reason that the title of this talk specifically implicates level design is quite simple. I learned everything I know through my work as a level designer back then, especially making Doom levels. So in the second part of this talk, I'm going to be talking a lot about Doom and about how Doom combat works, why it works, and how it creates systemic agency. And why I believe that even after all these years, Doom can still be a role model that other games can aspire to, because we might actually have forgotten some of that. Now, before I do this, though, I'm going to do some fundamentals. I'm going to talk about games in the second part, but before this, I can imagine an alternate reality in which I never actually made the decision of coming to America. So I'm back in Germany, I'm a biologist now, and I'm trying to figure out the same kind of question. And why do decisions matter to us? And because I'm a biologist, I might actually dig into evolution. And I might try to understand the biological underpinning as to why decisions are meaningful to us. Nature actually creates some very strict boundaries as to when and why organisms make decisions. And understanding those boundaries is actually going to be quite illuminating. But before I get to that in just a second, I want to give you some perspectives as to why nature is such a hard ass in the first place. Having brains is a luxury. Brains are really expensive. Might be lost on us because we have a McDonald's around every single corner, so we can just get all the energy that we need to actually feed this really hungry brain. But 20% of energy for an organ that's that tiny, that's a really big problem. So in nature, having a brain and using that to make decisions really is a luxury. They have actually, and we also can't assume that a large brain automatically comes with benefits, because there's been some really cool artificial evolution experiments with fruit flies that show how being smarter doesn't actually make you fitter to survive. Like they bred some really smart fruit flies and some really dumb fruit flies and then put them together, and all the smart fruit flies just died out. Because there was some cost to actually being smart and actually thinking about stuff. And I guess there's something to be said for intuition over conscious thinking. So there's a real physiological cost that we know about, even if we don't know exactly how, to having a brain. And that's the cost of building it, maintaining it, and using it. And when an animal does have a large brain and then uses that large brain to actually make decisions, there's got to be a reason for it. Now, there's one more major cost to having a large brain. And tell me why that is, but it's the cost of making decisions. Now, of course, the problem with decisions is that as soon as you make a decision, you can make a mistake, and nature doesn't like mistakes. Mistakes mean you're going to die. And nature is going to try to protect animals from making decisions in the first place whenever possible, and it's going to try to give them some sort of innate behavior. So in biology, there's actually an entire field of behavioral ecology that studies exactly when and why and how animals make decisions. Now, I'm totally butchering it for this talk, but the general rule is this. There are there are two situations in which animals learn, and there's one where they don't learn, and there's one where they do. You like that transition? Like my eyes always glaze over. So animals don't learn when a pattern is so simple that an innate strategy is possible, because in this case, evolution can just slowly hard-code the entire reaction via an innate behavior. So we get a cheaper brain out of that. Animals also don't learn, and they don't make decisions, when a situation is so complex that a strategy is completely impossible to discern, because the actual patterns underlying that situation are not discernible. So we might as well act randomly, right? That's just as good as a strategy. If you're a little animal living on the forest floor here and you can't really make out all of this perspective, you're not going to understand when the next meal pops up. It's pretty much impossible for you to actually make order out of the chaos, so you might as well search randomly, because it's just as effective and it's going to be much cheaper again. So this is pretty much nature button mashing, right? Because that's going to get you to the same result. Now, this doesn't mean, just to be clear, that there isn't a pattern here. It just means that for this specific animal, for its particular lifestyle, it's not possible or worthwhile to actually start making decisions. Now, of course, there's this spot in the middle. And this is where we are making decisions. It's what I call the sweet spot. It's an environment that is so variable and complex that we can never actually develop an innate strategy for it, but where the patterns themselves are still discernible enough to where we can actually learn the patterns and we can start making decisions. And as a general rule, in nature, this happens when your own best strategy is not your children's best strategy. But more generally, you might also say that the more unpredictable yet discernible an environment of a species is, the more decision-making is going to occur, which of course is exactly our environment, right? That's the environment we live in, and that's why we like learning so much, because we live in this world. We do that so we can make future decisions. Now, real life is also the reason why we play games, because real life is so seemingly chaotic that navigating all of the uncertainty of the real world is really emotionally taxing. Right? Real life is not so complex. That's a problem, that we might as well just act randomly. I mean, that might be a strategy. I don't know if anybody's tried that out, but there are enough patterns to where you actually want to learn and make decisions. But the problem is that it's certainly not so simple that there's one innate strategy to deal with all of life. Well, there's one, I guess, which is heavy drinking. But beyond that, there aren't really innate strategies to actually dealing with life. So the real world is much closer over here somewhere, right? Where it's discernible, but not always, like, we can't actually always make it out, than it is to this. Now games, on the other hand, are exactly in the sweet spot, because they're unpredictable yet highly discernible environments which are really rich in feedback. So achieving mastery over this environment is just immensely pleasurable to us, because it's the better version of life. So this should help us on the biological level a little bit why and when choice matters. Well, at least the way that nature looks at it. All right? Choice matters in nature when the environment is so complex that an innate strategy is not possible, but patterns are discernible. And the best strategy changes across generations. And we play games because the real world is often seemingly random, whereas in games, patterns are much easier to discern and feedback is much easier to get. So real life is over there, and games are somewhere over here. Now finally, the biologist in me just believes that choice matters to all of us, because the saying that a mind is a terrible thing to waste is actually true. At least in nature, because evolution won't even let you create that mind. You can't waste it. Because nature doesn't develop any sort of brains for frivolous actions. Animals only make decisions when there's no other way to deal with the situation, or until they create McDonald's, I guess. Now, this is a little bit of a false equivalence, of course. We cannot simply equate human brains and human decision-making to animal brains, animal decision-makings, but evolutionary biology is valid, and this is like incredibly humbling to me. Just having the knowledge that there are various birds out in nature which digest parts of their brain seasonally when that brain isn't required, because it's actually cheaper to break down the brain and build it back up next season than to keep it. That's incredibly humbling, right? So the way I look at every decision that I put in my games is that they should be subject to that same kind of evolutionary pressure, where it falls into this area where nature would actually require you to develop a brain for it. No, that's all great, but it's 60 minutes in and I've been talking about a lot of biology. I actually put a check mark into these 2 points, but I'm not quite done with it, because this might be a little bit esoteric. So I actually want to look at it from one more angle before I get to doom, and that's the psychology of motivation, which might be something that we're all a little bit more familiar with. Now, up until the 50s, 59 actually, psychology was bleak. Behavior was always reduced to a small number of primary drives: hunger, thirst, sex, the avoidance of pain, and pretty much everything that we were doing was supposedly motivated by deficits. So you were always in the red and you were just trying to break even. You're always looking because you were hungry, thirsty, you wanted to do the other stuff. Or, and as you were doing all of this, you didn't want to get hurt. And that to me is pretty bleak. And luckily, well, actually there was a problem with this. This theory could not actually explain play. There were a whole bunch of examples where humans and animals were engaging in activities that didn't support any of those primary drives. And it's kind of hard to justify that drive theory is the primary way in which we're actually making decisions when rats are going through electrified wire just because they want to explore. Obviously, the avoidance of pain is not a strong enough drive for them to just go fuck off and look at some other part of the laboratory. So this is where Robert White in 1959 came along, and he put a positive spin, which I like much better, on what motivates us. He took intrinsic motivation seriously, and he championed it as an actual primary motivator. He proposed this concept of competence motivation for activities in which the sole rewards for the spontaneous feeling of interest and enjoyment that occur when one engages in the activities. Now, these days, we unite competence as well as autonomy and relatedness, and then the umbrella of self-determination theory, which is one of the most widely studied and applied theories of motivations, including games. There's actually a book which was co-written by one of the founders of self-determination theory called Glued to Games. And it applies all of the findings of SDT to computer games and analyzes exactly why games are incredibly good at fulfilling our basic psychological needs and why they make us good to play. Now, the needs again are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And I don't want to go too deep into it and try to really get distracted by all of the details of the psychology. If you do want to do that, you can read this book, and you should read it on top of Glued to Games, because there's no reason why every game designer and game developer shouldn't have done that already. But so here are just the highlights, the important things you need to know for the rest of this talk. STD proposes that all three of these categories, competence, autonomy, and relatedness, are universal needs, that they are not motivated by deficits, that they're innate to all human beings, and that they are essential to our health and well-being. And if one, or ideally more than one, of these needs is fulfilled by an activity, we feel intrinsically motivated, right? We feel good. So games are really good at making us feel competent, autonomous, and related. We save the world, we explore the world, or ourselves as we're doing that, and people keep showering us with recognition, or we get to kill them in multiplayer. I mean, that's a way to feel related to somebody as well, I guess. And I think that SDT can also explain when and why decisions are meaningful to us, because I submit that decisions in games are going to be meaningful to us when the outcome of that decision satisfies one of our needs of competence, autonomy, or relatedness. And this is something that you do not see explicitly explored in Glued to Games, because ultimately it's a psychology book. But it has to be this way, because games make us feel good by satisfying psychological need. The medium specificity of games is interactivity, and the only way to engage with that interactivity is by making choices. So making decisions must actually lead to some sort of emotional well-being. But only, and that's the one big caveat, if our psychological needs of CAR, as I call it, competence, autonomy, or relatedness, are actually fulfilled. Right? So this is the other way in which I'm looking into why decisions are meaningful to us. If one of these base needs is going to be fulfilled in some shape or form, then the decisions that lead to that, they're going to be interesting or meaningful to us. Okay, so let's get to Doom, and let's get to an example of how all this information hopefully all starts forming one big picture and starts working out in practice, and how through all of this we can figure out what this mythical systemic agency actually is and why Doom has so much of it. Actually, I want to do one quick poll. Who here, by show of hands, is over 28 years old? Okay, that's still quite a few. It's absolutely amazing to me that Doom is 20 years old. Because you know what that means? Now you can tell me you did it, but there's going to be a whole generation of level designers and game designers who are going to be entering the industry who weren't even alive when Doom came out. And that is pretty crazy. But so it actually is 20 years old. So you know what, let's just gain some perspective and remember, or imagine if you have to, what it was like to play Doom back then for the first time. You're entering this 3D environment which is completely overpowering your senses, right? I mean, yes, Wolfenstein had been out, Ultima Underworld was out there, but the way that Doom really controlled and how you were moving around was something very new. And because it was very new, you had no idea how to move around. You weren't really good at it. I mean, how did you even control this game? Was it keyboard, mouse, joystick? I went through all of those. So now you're clumsy moving around because you don't know exactly how to control the game. You don't know what's ahead, so you're scared shitless of all the monsters coming at you, and you're probably just standing there and shooting at them frantically because you can't even move around competently. But then you play the game for a little bit, and you realize you can actually strafe. And what's better, you can actually strafe to avoid all of those fireballs which are shooting at you. After a while, you might even be good enough to use that strafing to get closer to enemies instead of running away from them. So you actually start feeling pretty good about playing this game. Well, then you hit E1 M8, you meet your first 2 Barons of Hell, and you're mortified again. You die a couple of times. But then you know what? You realize you can circle strafe around them as well, and they're not really all that bad, as I figured out, because they take exactly 5 full blasts with the double-barreled shotgun, and they're done. Now, of course, to be having a double-barreled shotgun, you had to be playing Doom 2, because Doom 1 didn't have that weapon. But that's actually the game that I made all of my levels for. And it just took me that long because I didn't have a modem before that, so I couldn't actually download an editor. But so when I started playing Doom then, or when I started making levels for Doom, I was already an expert Doom player, and I could actually apply all of that knowledge as to how Doom was fun on that level to making my levels. And it was one hell of a formative experience. I mean, obviously I'm doing a talk on it now. It taught me a lot about game and level design. Now, Doom is also a great example of how good action games satisfy competence needs and how at the lowest level actually make us feel good. So I want to look at that first. Competence is defined as an intrinsic need. The intrinsic need to effectively deal with the environment, to actually master it, to not be bumbling around and falling over our own feet and so on. Glued to Games calls it the experience of overcoming a challenge or extending our abilities in a meaningful way. To be truly satisfying, however, our successes need to occur in the context of a real challenge. And that's what Doom is, right? It provides an environment that we can master in the context of a real challenge. There's no doubt that the fine motor skills required to aim, the timing skills that you're going to have to line up enemies and shoot at them, the judgment that's going to be needed for missile weapons, because those are moving enemies, and just the general rhythm and cadence that's going to come out of how quickly your weapons and the enemy weapons are shooting. Now, these are all elements which are going to combine into a very compelling challenge. So the act of playing Doom at this low level can be committed to procedural memory at some point, what we call muscle memory, right? At some point, I can actually play Doom in my sleep. It's not quite an innate behavior, but it's the closest we can get to actually having something imprinted in our brain. So everything about Doom kind of feeds into an established narrative of why we like action games so much. We're inherently motivated to achieve competence over an environment or an object. I still can't do this. And games are this really feedback-rich environment that tests our survival skills and that keep us optimally challenged as we're achieving mastery over all of the dangers which are literally like threatening our very existence. Now the question here is that the way we talk about Dooms, we're talking about survival skills. Does that actually have to do anything with choice? Like I said earlier, that decisions are bound to be meaningful when they fulfill some sort of base psychological need like competence, but how does this actually apply to a skill check, survival skills? Because this is supposed to be instinctual, right? It's supposed to be imprinted in our muscle memory. So where at the lowest level is the choice here? Maybe my entire thesis just falls apart and I shouldn't have done this talk, but I mean, that's part of the narrative. Doom is a really good action game. Action games are fun and compelling and meaningful because, well, tense, and oh my God, look at all the skill checks. But in fact, if you're looking at my design eraser, I have explicitly put skill check as a component in there, so I can actually test for that, like the twitch skills which are going to come out of something. Now, one thing we have to remember here, where it doesn't fall apart, is that a skill check is not something a player actually does. It's something that a player reacts to. And how we react to the skill check is by making decisions. All right? According to Glue 2 Games, a game has to have 3 properties to fulfill these competent needs. It has to have clarity about the goal at hand, challenge that is not overwhelming, and clear feedback on our actions that make us feel like we learned something. And it's exactly this last part right here that is so important, because it actually does explain how games are meaningful at the moment-to-moment level. Because if we do react to skill checks by making decisions and adjusting our aim and so on, we need to be fully in control. And that requires very good science and feedback as well as very good controls in the first place. So what I really mean when I ask what is the skill check or the meaningful choice is probably this. How good are the 3 C's and the science and feedback that are implicated whenever the game expects me to react to a skill check by making a split-second decision? Right? Because I can only make split-second decisions really well if the 3 C's, camera, character, control, are awesome, and when the science and feedback I'm getting to everything that I'm doing is very clear and unambiguous. Because then I can get into this flow state where the controls just melt away and I'm one with the game. And that's where my competence needs actually fulfilled, because the amount of immediate feedback from the game, like to each of my low-level actions, actually allows me to master all of the skill checks that the game is throwing at me. So science and feedback, at least in the skill check scenario, are actually the lowest level in which a game creates systemic agency and agency in general. And that might be a little bit weird because the way we usually talk about agency is in terms of big decisions and big choices. In fact, we often abuse it now to just say something like player freedom, which is wrong. Agency just means, at the simplest level, that it is the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices. And that's exactly a big part of the reason why we feel so much in control of the combat encounter and we get into this flow state in a game like this, because of the low-level systemic agency that's afforded via the science and feedback and the 3 C's. And that then in return creates satisfaction of our competence needs, right? That's what we're feeling really good about having mastered this environment. So you might actually say that Doom at the lowest level is a series of interesting decisions, although you might really have to say it's a series of low-level control-related decisions. Right? But everything I do in this game is discernible and integrated, and the decisions that I make, such as how to move around, where to move, when to shoot, actually matter. So that's part of this. Mastering skill checks via good 3 C's and via good science and feedback, and they do need to be good, because if they're not good, we can't control the game, and then the competence needs aren't actually fulfilled. But this creates agency. And this low-level agency that I'm talking about is certainly part of systemic agency in making sure that, the game plays and feels good. Now, of course, the question is that all? Because if the fulfillment of all the competence needs is the only good thing that an action game needs, there's a lot of games out there that should be awesome, right? Glued to Games actually has a section in which it analyzes Doom, specifically through the lens of competence. It's kind of one of their poster charts, and it makes this argument. It says that it is the gradual progression of challenges as the player marches into hell that provides the strongest motivational pull of Doom in virtually all successful FPS games. That progression is key. With each hellish opponent you fell, there's a small victory won on your road to the larger goal. From a competence standpoint, these small moment-to-moment victories are more like a trail of chocolates, each providing a small bite of satisfaction as the player succeeds and progresses towards a larger victory. That's quite poetic. I don't want to put words in their mouth. To me, this reads a little bit like what they're saying is that you need to be able to point a gun at somebody, and you need to be able to overcome a progression of challenges, of skill checks, and if you do that, you're going to have a really successful first-person shooter game. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually do agree with this in one way. I do believe that Doom's rational level design, like the game system story, of which I didn't have a picture except for 1313, but I believe this is important, right? Like, overcoming the challenges thrown at me in Doom and how finely that's tuned is a big part of why that game is good. But having played as much Doom as I have in my lifetime and just playing the same level over and over again, I think if we just have this outlook, we seriously miss the mark. Because we're trying to identify competence needs as the main reason as to why Doom's gameplay was so successful. And how many modern games do you know that have good aiming, good movement, good science and feedback, and they probably have an enemy progression as well, where things get harder, and it's still not really fun to play because there's some sort of spark missing. I mean, hell, I only have to stay within the same franchise and go one game down to know that a competent execution of a progression of challenges is just not enough. So there's a danger to thinking about action games in terms of competence only. And that's a trap that many games unfortunately fall into. I would have loved to play an extra clip here. But this is why playing Doom 1 and 2, analyzing Doom 1 and 2 is really a big deal to me. That's why I'm doing it, because to me it's the reminder that Doom doesn't just frame its core component, its systemic agency in terms of competence. There's something else to Doom, something else that needs to be there to really make good combat in these kind of shooters. Something that satisfies another psychological need, and that's autonomy. And pretty much what this comes down to is that Doom works because it has orthogonal unit differentiation. Now, I love the term orthogonal unit differentiation because in pretentiousness and awkwardness, it's only second to ludonarrative dissonance. So I'll spare myself some trouble here. I'll just call it OUD, or simply differentiation, but we should talk about it. It's something that Harvey Smith introduced at GDC in 2003, so this was like 11 years ago. OUD gives us a way to talk about how game systems are meaningfully differentiated in their abilities and behaviors, and how that distinction leads to some interesting and complex gameplay. It leads to what I called in 2012 an expressive possibility space. But once again, this was a little bit misleading, so I'm going to take it from the top and actually start by establishing a better presentation or representation of Doom's possibility space in the first place. And here's something that you figure out after playing Doom for a long time. The enemies and the weapon in this game are actually really finely tuned to interact on multiple axes. What first looks like this visceral, barely controllable, maybe even simplistic fight for survival is actually this really complex interplay of many gameplay elements that allow for ever new tactics and strategies. And this all happens via OUD. Because if you're looking at the enemy classes in Doom, I can map every single enemy type across some orthogonally differentiated categories. There's an axis where I can map all of the hit scan versus projectile guys, right? Those are the two classes of enemies that exist in Doom. And then I can also do this by the amount of damage they do. And then there's a second axis, which are charging enemies versus enemies which stay back, which is just a function of their overall speed, but also the behavior that they're subject to. Then if I put all of this together, I can create a chart that looks like this. And this is actually a pretty accurate representation of Doom's possibility space, at least as it pertains to these specific enemies and what's important to me. And as you notice, the enemy distribution actually already covers a large part of the entire spectrum. I left out some enemies there, so I'm sure I could pretty much fill it in all the way. But what this does is allow the player to have a very specific opinion on each enemy type, because they know what they stand for. And that allows them to prioritize enemies in each encounter. So if I'm looking at this example, like which enemy would you want to take out first with your shotgun? I'm assuming it's that black shotgunner dude back there, because he has a hit scan weapon and he can deal immediate damage. And I know about this. Whereas all those fireballs that are thrown at me, I can dodge those. Those guys are called imps, by the way, in case you didn't play Doom. So the reason why Doom works so well is that each enemy represents a distinct, consistent, and discernible behavior that can be learned. And because there are only a few traits to all of these enemies, which just fall across two axes, I can actually learn this rather quickly. So this is information that players are going to internalize, and that's really important to them. So I want to look at how the player actually processes and stores this kind of information. And they do this via a psychological construct called a schema, which is an organized pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationship among them. And then information which is thrown at me is either assimilated, it's pretty much integrated into the schema, into an existing one, or it can be accommodated, which means that it doesn't fit, and I actually have to create a new schema for this information because I realized that a striped horse is actually a zebra and not a striped horse. We can actually be a little bit finer with what exactly a schema is, and we can do this by what information they store. We call schemas a frame when they contain properties and behaviors of something, and we call them a script when they encode some sort of processes how we approach a situation or how we deal with an object. So in Doom's case, the attributes of the enemy would be its frame, while the player tactics of how I actually approach this enemy would be its script. And players can easily create frames and scripts for each enemy type in Doom. They know exactly what the enemy represents, how best to deal with them, and everything is very clear-cut because it's all differentiated. So far so good. All of the individual units have clear and concise properties and behaviors, which creates like some very clearly discernible patterns to each one of these guys. And just each pattern encountered on its own is going to be a no-brainer. What's interesting is what happens once I put them into conflict, because then quite literally all hell breaks loose. Looking back at this picture right here, do we really want to take out the shotgunner first? Is that a script that I can reliably follow for all of Doom? Deal with the hit scan guys first. Because that black dude in the back certainly can shoot us immediately while I dodge all the fireballs by those imps, except that that imp over there has actually gotten pretty close to me, right? I might not be able to strafe out of the way anymore. So this is actually a judgment call. I don't actually know exactly how I'm going to prioritize the situation. And I call this, funnily enough, prioritization choice, because I get to have an opinion on how to approach this encounter and how I prioritize it. Now, prioritization choice is created from the complex interplay of systems that are easily understood individually, but that combine into situations that don't have a consistent or obviously superior tactic. And that creates a really interesting game in Doom in which the overall combat experience is clearly defined. Like there is a quality to playing Doom. There's an overall strategy to playing Doom as well. And I can learn that, and I still remember that, have it internalized. It involves prioritizing enemies, lots and lots of strafing around, lining up enemies in very specific lines, picking the right weapon for the right job, and so on. But what I can't ever do for Doom is create a script that works for all combat encounters in Doom equally. And that's because the combination of multiple orthogonally differentiated enemies creates situations in which an obviously superior tactic pretty much never exists. And this is really interesting to our brains, right? This actually leads to interesting decisions because what we've created now is something quite familiar. It's this. It's an environment in which patterns are individually discernible, but they combine into non-trivial situations. And these non-trivial situations can't be learned because they change across generations. Well, at least if you imagine that each combat encounter is a new generation. So an innate strategy is never possible. And unlike this flow experience, like in the low-level movement mechanics that I get to have, we can't go on autopilot when playing Doom. We always have to stay engaged, and we have to keep learning. And learning is actually fun. A more visual way of communicating what I'm talking about here might be through these patterns, because each one is easily understandable and discernible. But once I start arranging these patterns into a specific combat configuration, maybe taking distance to the player into account, I get this. Right? The patterns are still clearly discernible, but as they overlay, they become harder to make out. They do offer specific points of attack. There's one here, probably, where the overlap happens. There's one here, and it looks like there's a really good one over here. But, of course, combat itself is fluid. It's dynamic. I keep moving around, switching weapons, and so on. So once the player starts interacting by doing this, something like this happens. The patterns rearrange themselves. And the player actually has agency over that as well. The player kind of turns into a DJ. Like the player can actually scrub the patterns and find specific new ways of attack. If I'd had Flash for this, I could have done a really cool animation on this, right? But it's just a metaphor anyway. But if you played Doom or you remember this probably rings true. Because if you remember all of the gameplay systems, there were things like enemy infighting. So I actively tried to trigger that by lining up enemies very specifically. And I was scrubbing the patterns to align themselves just the right way. There's weapon differentiation. So I keep switching weapons depending on enemy types and on distance. And that's something that was called the pain chance, where select monsters can be kept from ever actually shooting at you if you keep needling them with bullets. Because the Cacodemon, I know exactly, had a 90% pain chance. So the chances of him getting a shot off were really, really small. So I'd actually use that to my advantage. I would position myself so that the Cacodemon was occluding all the hit scanners on the opposite end of the map. So now he was this living shield as he was getting riddled with bullets from both sides. So that's kind of my analysis what Doom was all about. If you played the game, all of this might ring true. Depending on how much you played the game or when you last played it, some of this might have been some small aha moments. But Doom did all of this, as I said, because it afforded what I called this prioritization choice, which means that prioritization is possible. There are multiple ways to prioritize, so there's choice between how I do it, and choices are roughly equally weighted so that the player has options and is able to actually have an opinion on each combat encounter. And what all this means, the result is that there's no clearly superior combat script which exists for the entire game, which keeps it interesting. Now, there's also something that it's not, right? Prioritization choice does not mean that it's a free-for-all of approaches. We're not trying to create tons and tons of trivial choices. Like how these choices are differentiated still needs to be meaningful as well. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we author it, but I think it kind of happens automatically. There's actually one more thing here, is what it's not, but I'll get to that in just a bit. Let me just figure out why prioritization choice. I always pick this one word where I just completely let this every talk. But so let's figure out why prioritization choice is meaningful. And the short answer is it's meaningful to us because it makes the player an active participant in how combat shakes out. It satisfies autonomy needs. And autonomy is actually a little bit trickier than talking about competence because it's not just what you might think, which is freedom. It's not about just allowing to do whatever, like those rats. Autonomy is actually about choice and opportunity. It reflects our innate desire to take actions out of personal volition and not because we're controlled by circumstances or by others. It's an incredibly powerful psychological need, probably more so than competence, because, well, we don't like being controlled. Right? Which actually brings me back to this last point of what prioritization choice is not. It is not a way to force enemies on the player. Because autonomy is a fickle thing. Just like its fulfillment can really improve enjoyment of an activity, if you stomp on it, it can severely damage motivation. Right? There's actually tons of research on that, which you might have heard about in the general domain of extrinsic motivation and achievements and so on. Honestly, as game players, we can probably easily just identify with this sentiment because we play games because we don't like being controlled by circumstance or by other. And so we need to be a little bit careful. Well, we don't like being controlled in a combat encounter, I might argue, because if authoritative enemy scripting creates something where wave after wave of enemies arrives in exactly the same way, checkpoint restart after checkpoint restart as I die, that sucks. I mean, that's a pattern which, is not really something that's interesting to me. Gotta take this with a grain of salt, of course. It's not an absolute rule. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use attention grabbers like charging enemies to spice up an encounter, right? I'm just saying that we cannot spoon-feed enemies via too authoritative scripting. So, prioritization choice is meaningful because it satisfies autonomy needs and because it creates an environment that looks exactly like the sweet spot right here. And Doom has really strong systemic agency because I can actually put those two things together. I have my low-level ability to master skill checks, and I add an autonomy level on top of it via OUD. Right? We add autonomy to what at first glance is a linear game, even though the way you go through the game looks exactly the same on a 2D map. The way I can play it is going to be very different as I'm playing through it again and again and again. So finally, the reason why all of this is meaningful to us is because good systemic agency, once I put all of this together, creates meaning because we get to learn like kids via a constructivist approach. This is pretty much what Piaget was talking about, right? It's just this idea that the amount of information that I get to learn in combat, in a game that has this really big possibility space, is so diverse that we're constantly assimilating or accommodating new information. We constantly update our mental models. Things don't get stale. So I would be remiss if, once again, I didn't talk about how we actually offer for all of this. Like, how do we ensure that this level of systemic agency I'm talking about here is actually created? Now, I could probably buckle down and do math furiously. I could try to take all of the meaningful combinations or figure out the number of all the meaningful combinations by tallying up all of the different core mechanics of the game and of the system, and then I could figure out all the combinations, permutations, binomial probabilities of the game, and it just sounds like design masturbation, doesn't it? I've never actually done this in my professional career beyond like sets with small cardinality. If you really want to dive into this, there's a rabbit hole you can go down. You can look up the topic of computational complexity, and you can look at how our minds actually have a preference for games which are p-space complete, which is like a certain computational problem with certain computers which can solve it. Ralph Costa talked about this in his last GDC Next lecture. So if you want to look at it, that's great. But to me, I think I'm going to be much, much simpler in my advice. I'm going to tell you that you simply have to follow the rules that we've already laid out. It was all there the entire time. You have to ensure that the enemies are differentiated across a scale that's clearly defined on each end. And those should be opposed in some shape or form, ideally. You have to make sure that each system has a clearly understood frame and script, so that you create clearly discernible patterns out of all of this. And then you need to make sure that, well, the game controls really well and your signs and feedback are clear and unambiguous. There's no question when this guy is dying, right? Just like it doesn't matter if it's a cover shooter where you could just go back behind cover, he's dead. And then the way I usually test this is the super scientific method of what I call the checkpoint test. It's this idea that I can simply play the encounter multiple times, imagining that I had died multiple times, and I see if the patterns rearrange themselves meaningfully different, to where I actually feel like, let me try that again, because there's got to be a better way or a different way this time to figure this out. And if you do all of this, then you create this mystical cream that I was talking about in 2012. You get to fill your game with cream, which we didn't do in Unreal 2 at that point, as you might remember. So there's an entire list here, which I'm going to kind of skip over because I feel like I explained most of them. The highlights pretty much are this. You need to ensure that your 3 Cs are top-notch, because we can't feel competent if we can't control the game. You need to make sure that you have very clear signs and feedback, because they actually create agency at the lowest level, and that's vital to a feeling of competence. And you need to create clearly understood systems. And weapons are part of this as well, right? Like there's a whole other talk where we can look at weapon design and how that is meaningfully differentiated, and why there's a reason we only have like 4 or 5 weapon types across all games. And everything else, once again, to me is design masturbation, because telling me, yeah, you can create your custom weapon, just create system soup in the middle somewhere there. That's a different talk. I mean, I talked about it in the terms of enemies, and that's what you need to do. Make sure they're orthogonally differentiated, because that creates the potential for some sort of prioritization choice. And I hope after all of this, I don't really have to go into much detail as to why Dead Space 2 is made from exactly the same cloth as Doom. Well, unless you didn't play the games. But like Dead Space 2 has a cast of differentiated characters with very distinct frames and scripts, good silhouettes as well, so I can immediately tell who is who. And they're differentiated across enemies that rush and enemies that are shooting at me from behind. And then it actually does something which pretty much no other game does. It embeds meaningful choice right inside each enemy type as well, because you get to dismember all of these necromorphs. And you can do that in multiple places, and depending on where you do it, you actually get different reactions. So there's meaningful choice there. Plus, you get a wide variety of differentiated weapons that also have very specific profiles and behavior. So Dead Space 3 actually creates prioritization choice on multiple levels, via enemy dismemberment, enemy prioritization, and via weapon choice as well. And then it adds some systems like stasis on top of it, where the player then becomes the DJ and he gets to scrub around and like exactly which pattern he wants to create and who he wants to freeze. So maybe I told you something new. maybe I told you yesterday's news because you feel like all games do this to some degree. I don't think we're doing it enough. And we might not even know exactly what we got when we are doing it. And that's why I called Unreal 2 such a big disappointment in 2012. And the ironic part actually is that I was constantly talking about Doom. We made Unreal 2 in 2000, like 99, 2000. So I was constantly talking about Doom and how awesome it was. And then I didn't actually have the tools to convert any of that knowledge into gameplay. But I feel that even when you do have differentiated enemy types, there are quite a few games that do that. You have the shotgunner, you have the sniper, and so on. There's still quite a few games that then fail the checkpoint test because they're way too authoritative in how they dish out those enemies. Maybe they don't have the systemic depth to support systemic behavior, systemic combat, or maybe that's just what the designers are doing. But ultimately, my feeling for autonomy is then stomped upon. And if I don't die in the game, it's going to be an awesome experience. But that's just because I don't know what's missing. What are some games that do it right? Well, Halo is the big one, right? And I don't even know how much I have to say about it. There are differentiated enemies across strength and behavior with very clear silhouettes. There are enemy weapons, there are hit scan weapons. There's this interplay between how I take down shields and enemy, energy and so on. And they actually add something which I don't think gets a lot of credit for being a design innovation instead of just a controller limitation, which was weapon churn. Like back when Halo came out, it was the first mainstream game where you could only have 2 weapons at the same time. And that wasn't because maybe it was also because they couldn't have a big inventory, but really it was constantly forcing you to make meaningful choice about what kind of weapon you were taking into the next part of combat. And if you failed the checkpoint, well, how you would approach the combat the next time you played it. There's absolutely no accident that the reason I know about this book, the one you should read, is via Jamie Griesmer, who was the lead designer on Halo for the first, I think, 3 games. I think Batman is really good. It creates all of these small gameplay molecules with differentiated enemy types. Right? So as I'm interacting with one of these bubbles of combat, I get into the slow state of combat, and then I'm actually trying to prioritize or just avoid guys as well at that low level. And when somebody's picking up a weapon, I'm trying to go for him, so on. So that's all happening through exactly what we're talking about here. And then I guess Star Wars 1313 did it pretty well. And I can't put any slides up here. But I feel like the OUD in our game, which was a cover shooter, was actually quite good, where with just 4 enemy archetypes, we were actually able to get something that didn't fail a checkpoint test, because we had enemies with clearly discernible behaviors, where I could have an opinion on what would happen. I knew this guy would charge me. I knew this guy would be throwing grenades. I knew this guy would not stop for anything, but I had a certain weapon that I could use to slow him down, and so on. So that for me is just the way I've been trying to apply all of these lessons to the way I'm making games. Yeah. I'm going to let you stare at this picture for a little bit longer. It's actually the perfect symbol for a decision that's meaningful in nature. I just had to cut the about 20 slides that explain it. But if you want to know how the reed warbler has to make a really meaningful choice, it can predict when a cuckoo egg is in its nest or not. Might put it in the slide downloads. But there used to be a time when everybody in the industry had played Doom. That was pretty much the baseline, right? So there wasn't any question about like what it does and what it is and what it isn't. And that won't be the case anymore very soon. And that means it's up to all of us to actually continue that tradition. We have to continue to make games that take its place, right? Because we have to create a new generation of game and level designers that understand simply by playing the game the virtues of good gameplay and creating this kind of systemic agency. Now, this may have been a systems design talk. It probably was. It was. But the fact that I learned all of this through level design is incredibly important to me, because being a level designer on a really good game with low-level systems made me a better game designer. Working as a level designer in Doom was incredibly fun. It actually still required a lot of thought. It's not like you just randomly distributed enemies. It's just that you had so many choices in how you applied that possibility space and just kind of distributed it across the map, and in how you then formed the entire environment around that. Being a level designer on Dead Space was actually very similar, because in Dead Space, the systemic agency is so high that I can create a compelling encounter by just putting 3 slashers in a room, which is the base enemy. because they're all going to advance at me and they're going to kill me. There's no question about that. So I'm going to stasis the first guy. I'm going to try to take off the legs of the second guy so that he doesn't get to me. I'm going to kill the third guy just as he gets to me. At that point, the first guy, who isn't in stasis anymore, is starting to charge me now. Oh, and oops, I missed, and I actually took off somebody's head, and now those guys are charging me. And if just that, as a base encounter, is something that's inherently interesting, then just imagine what you get to do on top of that by combining all of these different enemy types and actually scripting combat around that. So I didn't actually do any of this. I'm not taking credit for it, right? I was just a level designer applying that space's possibility space. I got to be, this is what I said in 2012, I got to be a guide to the possibility space. I got to MacGyver new gameplay situations from the game because the actual underlying systems were very simple and clearly delineated. I don't know if you guys saw this Kotaku article, which just came out like a few days ago. It just made me chuckle. Here were gamers surprised, outraged even, to find that maybe there's a reason why enemies in games are dumb and predictable. Well, no, they're dumb and predictable. I hope you understand this, because games are the antidote for a life that is too chaotic. Life is over there, and games clearly live here. Doesn't mean we can't advance in a whole bunch of interesting and meaningful ways there, but ultimately there's a reason why all of these things are very easily categorized and are kind of stereotypes. Life is, however, orthogonally differentiated. It might be incredibly chaotic, but there is a clear choice that I get to make, right? I get to make the choice whether I wanted to be a biologist or a game designer, and I didn't have the benefits of safe games or checkpoints. So in life, choices matter just because they matter. I know I made the correct one, right? I don't regret the choice of becoming a game designer one bit. I just realized that just like in life, game design is uncomfortably chaotic. It's really hard to find patterns of good game design in there. It's very intuitive. Now we have to remember, just in game design, just like in life, things only appear to be random. There actually are patterns in there, which is why we're searching for them, which is why all of you are coming to GDC. Right? We're searching for patterns to bring some order to the chaos, which is game development. Now in this talk, I tried to figure out why action shooters like Doom at the low level, at the core level, are inherently meaningful to us. And that's because there's some puzzle box with just the right amount of danger. And that's via systemic agency, which is this one specific pattern which I want to present to you. I hope it actually came through clear. I hope you found it useful, and I hope that as you go into the main conference, you find a whole bunch of other patterns that you can apply. So thank you for coming today from all of us, and that's me.